We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Here's a question for you to ponder. Was it dangerous for Dems in the midterms being perceived to be globally as the party of war? And what does this mean for them going forward? For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So since around the 1960s, the stereotype has been the Republicans are the hawks and the Dems are the doves. Our reality now tells us that the stereotype is no longer valid. How dangerous is this? And this takes me back to a July of 2020 CNBC story. CEO Dave Calhoun of Boeing said he was confident that whoever wins the White House in November, whether it's Trump or Biden, will continue supporting the defense industry. He basically said, doesn't matter to Boeing who wins the White House, we're still going to get paid. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, I think the question you raised is a profound one. I understand why there is dancing in the streets from the Atlantic to the Pacific, given the apparent setback given to the Trumpistas on the Tuesday elections. But I would like to caution our Democratic Party friends that we are not out of the woods yet with regard to this fascist danger that the Trumpistas provided and presented. I say that because historically, if you look at progressive movements in the United States, because the right wing is so strong in the United States, one of the ways we've been able to prevail is by taking advantage of global currents. That's the implication of the abolition of slavery in the 19th century, where we were assisted mightily by British abolitionists and Haitian revolutionaries. That's the implication of the retreat of Jim Crow, U.S. apartheid in the 20th century, where we were assisted mightily by the socialist camp, African liberation movements, Caribbean liberation movements as well. But right now, as we speak, you have the spectacle of Donald J. Trump being perceived as the antagonist of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is fighting now a proxy war in the Ukraine. You have the spectacle of the possible incoming speaker on the Republican side, speaking of Kevin McCarthy, suggesting that his party would not provide a so-called blank check for the prosecution of this war in the Ukraine. And as one who monitors closely and carefully anti-war and left-wing sentiment in Europe, not least, where there is growing anxiety about this war, many on the left, believe it or not, in Europe, were not necessarily happy with the Democratic Party triumph, because as they see it, that will put wind in the sails of this flailing escapade in Ukraine. And I would caution the Black community in particular, which has been generally absent from the barricades of peace and war for at least the last 75 years, that this community has probably the most to lose if the fascists make a comeback, which we can still not rule out. And certainly the labor movement, the AFL-CIO, somebody needs to walk over to their headquarters a stone's throw from your studio in Washington and instruct them that the Cold War ended. And so therefore, it no longer makes sense, if it ever did, for them to be supporting right-wing regimes globally. And so there needs to be a more nuanced message, a more nuanced analysis with regard to this election that took place. Otherwise, we'll be facing ourselves with even more grim and ghastly prospects in November 2024.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Horne. As I see this virulent anti-communist element arising in the Democratic Party, you know, the Biden spokesman out there, oh, it's the people at the border as a result of communists. When I see the powerful support for, I mean, pure fascist, literal Nazis in in Ukraine, when I see the party of John Conyers and the out of Afghanistan caucus and out of Iraq caucus now become, Pramila Jayapal, who can't go 24 hours without cheering for war, I can't help but feel that the party of John Conyers has turned into the party of John Bolton, and I'm certainly afraid of right-wing fascism. But there seems to be a streak of it that's very much alive in the Democratic Party that gives me great pause. Also,
well, certainly you have reason to be nervous and apprehensive. I would add further that when you have the Black community absent from the peace and war barricades, it basically puts wind in the sails of the Victoria Nulands of the Democratic Party. Recall that she's the State Department official who has been given blame, if not credit, for helping to engineer the disastrous events of 2014 that led to the seizure of Crimea and then, of course, led directly to this war. But on the other hand, I do think that there is a difference. I mean, I think that the fact that the Democratic Party rarely in the last 60 to 70 years has won a majority of the Euro-American vote across class lines. That was the case on Tuesday as well. And that the Democratic Party historically gets 8 or 9 out of 10 votes from the Black community. That at least will serve domestically as a kind of restraint domestically. It doesn't necessarily serve as a restraint globally. And that's the contradiction. That the Republicans, of course, do not have any brakes, any restraints domestically. And of course, they're more than willing to wage war abroad, as the people of Syria during the Trump era can tell you. Or if you look at their policies towards China between 2016 and 2020. So once again, we need more nuanced analysis because we're faced with a very complicated and complex political situation.
I want to combine two stories and get your take. One, Olaf Scholz's peace mission to China. This is an Asia Times story, and I take issue with a number of the elements in the story. Don't really want to get into that. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz goes to China to meet with Xi Jinping, and then and that was last week. Now we've got China and Vietnam. Vietnamese leader Trong visits Beijing, putting cooperation ahead of conflict. It seems as though we've had Vladimir Putin go to China. The Iranians have gone to China. There seems to be a new leader on the horizon, and it's Xi Jinping.
Well, there's a new biography of President Xi called The Most Important Leader in the World, or something to that effect. And I understand why such a biography would be published at this particular moment. It's important to mention on Veterans Day, November 11, 2022, that we face the grim prospect, the grim reality of having many veterans of the war in Vietnam sleeping in cardboard boxes on the streets. And their, quote, service, unquote, to the U.S. military was based on a mistaken premise. Recall that the idea then was the so-called domino theory, that if the communists prevailed in Vietnam, that would strengthen the communists in China. And then before you know it, the United States would have to face them in San Francisco and Los Angeles. But as it turns out, what happened after the United States was unceremoniously ousted from Indochina, now 1975, that as part of the deal that U.S. imperialism worked out with China, which has led to this juggernaut based on foreign direct investment from the North Atlantic bloc, that China waged war in Vietnam. It was a very bloody war. And in fact, implicated in that war was, of course, Vietnam's assistance in overthrowing the genocidal Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, which Vietnam charged was backed by the People's Republic of China. And recall that after Vietnam ousted the Khmer Rouge in the late 1970s, that the United States and China then ganged up on Vietnam. Now, supposedly, from the U.S. point of view, weakening Vietnam was part of the overall strategy of weakening the Soviet Union, since Moscow was the major supporter for Vietnam. To a certain degree, that, quote, worked, unquote, in the sense that the Soviet Union was overstretched and outstripped and therefore collapsed in 1991. But the premise that the war in Vietnam had to be fought in order to stop monolithic communism, it wasn't true during the war, it wasn't true after the war, and it's hardly true today, which adds further resonance to this trip by the leader of the Vietnamese Communist Party to Beijing in the last week or so, because before that trip, you had this loose talk in Washington about a military base for U.S. imperialism in Vietnam. That's apparently not in the cards, and I think that's one of the reasons why after Mr. Biden leads the COP27 environmental meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where is he headed? To Cambodia. Because I assume that the idea now is that the United States perhaps can entice and inveigle the Cambodians into having a military base there for U.S. imperialism as part of this present plan to encircle the People's Republic of China. As you suggested, another important summit took place between Chancellor Scholz of Germany and President Xi, and that was interesting because Chancellor Scholz obviously does not plan to go wholly over the cliff with regard to tailing after U.S. imperialism, because Washington was quite upset with this trip and the enhanced relations that will ensue between Berlin and Beijing. Perhaps Washington should console itself, because originally the plan was for President Macron and Chancellor Scholz to go to Beijing together. That certainly would have led to gnashing of teeth and wringing of hands in the Pentagon and the State Department. But at the same time, Chancellor Scholz might have weakened his coalition, which includes the Greens, which are hotly opposed to any sort of entente with China. They're quite hawkish with regard to China. And it's that contradiction that may ultimately bring down Chancellor Scholz's coalition, which may bring back to power the party of outgoing Chancellor Angela Merkel, which admittedly is to the right of the Social Democrats of Scholz, but certainly are more than willing to carry on doing business with Beijing.
You know, as the U.S. goes around Asia talking about how, trying to build a coalition, we see China, I believe it's Laos and Cambodia, and they're helping Cambodia build a port. They're putting high-speed rail into Laos. They just committed tens of millions, I think like $40 million to the Solomon Islands for their police department. And it seems that China's on a diplomatic / in Indonesia, diplomatic / economic mission to thwart the U.S.'s attempt to build a coalition against them, and to strengthen their ability to defend their region. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that you're on the money. And keep in mind, ask yourself the question, what was outgoing President Obama in 2016? Where was his last foreign trip? After the November election, it was no less to Myanmar, to Burma. Because that is one of the 14 nations that were seen as part of the encirclement of China. And now, as noted, you see Mr. Biden headed to Cambodia as well, part of that encirclement plan. And I must issue a cautionary note that I agree that China is working overtime to build positive relations with its neighbors. But keep in mind as well that historically, the United States has not been unwilling to play the ethnic card. What I mean is that part of the strength of China in Southeast Asia is the fact that in places like Indonesia, where the G20 meeting will take place, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Thailand, in Burma, in Myanmar, you have substantial populations of Chinese extraction that oftentimes dominate the commanding heights of the economy, at least in places where there is no Communist Party ruling, such as in Indonesia. That has led Washington in the past to try to stoke ethnic antagonism, which has led to virtual pogroms against the population of Chinese extraction throughout Southeast Asia. That also includes, I might say, the Philippines, where the United States probably has the strongest ties historically and the strongest relations. And so going forward, we must be on alert to stay the hand of the Pentagon and the State Department, which in their desperate maneuver to try to stem the rise of China, they may seek to try to stir anti-Chinese antagonisms throughout Southeast Asia. Because keep in mind, in addition to the foreign direct investment from the North Atlantic bloc that led to the rise of China, another lever that led to the rise of China over recent decades has been precisely investments from these Chinese elites in Indonesia, in Philippines, etc. They still maintain more or less friendly and close ties to Beijing, and that inevitably will become a target. Inevitably, it would lead, it seems to me, unless we're careful, to a stirring of the ethnic dissension pot.
Joe Biden's on its way to the G20. President Putin will not attend the summit in person in Bali. And it's interesting that Indonesia has resisted pressure from Western countries to withdraw its invitation to President Putin and expel Russia from the group. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, it was always a non-starter that Russia would be expelled from the G20. Certainly, Indonesia, Joko Widodo, the leader, would not have been able to do that unilaterally. It's very interesting as well that before the announcement was made that President Putin would not be attending the G20, you had all of these cloak and dagger plots coming out of the State Department to make sure that Mr. Biden would not bump into Mr. Putin in a hallway, leading to what Washington would consider to be some sort of faux pas or some sort of photograph that would not go down very well in the Democratic Party caucus on Capitol Hill. Now, Mr. Biden can breathe a sigh of relief, but he still has a steep mountain to climb because his mini summit with President Xi will present many problems because in many ways, President Xi holds the winning cards with regard to this ongoing confrontation with U.S. imperialism.
And you're talking about bumping into Joe Biden and President Putin bumping into each other. That makes me think about the John Kerry, Nicolas Maduro exchange that took place a couple of days ago, and they bumped into each other, shook hands, and laughed and joked, and that photograph upset a whole lot of folks. We've got 20 seconds.
Well, keep in mind that Mr. Maduro has been quite busy because he also bumped into President Macron of France, and they had a friendly exchange, although this may have been part of a calculated strategy by France because, as noted with regard to our conversation concerning Schultz in Beijing, the Western Europeans are trying to break away from the apron strings of Uncle Sam, which has led to this disaster in Ukraine and the possible deindustrialization and disasters for their national economies.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis. We look forward to having you back.